Hello, hello. Dr. Kirk here to talk more about American music. We are in week two, and last class session, we talked about American music beginning as a problem, not a specific style. And by problem, we mean that this was something that composers felt needed to be solved. We needed a distinctly American sounding music that was unified and true for all American music, which is a tough problem, isn't it? So, this week's focus, we're going to talk about nationalism versus cosmopolitanism. And we're going to talk about why early 20th century composers felt some cultural anxiety, not a confidence that we had anything unified or even that we were possibly able to solve this problem of American music. And the central question for the day, should American music assert independence from Europe or prove it belongs within European tradition? Now, there was a feeling, probably even prior to the 20th century, where composers, were just trying to prove that they were as good as European composers. Um, on the other hand, we did want to have independence from Europe so that we could be individual and distinctly American. So nationalism, versus cosmopolitanism. Nationalism, as we discussed in our last class session, became a real preoccupation of composers in the Romantic era. This is true of European composers and also became true of American composers, that they were trying to describe something that was more uniquely them, relating their homeland, their childhood, their place of birth, whatever you choose, a cultural or specific identity, um, different than Mozart sounding like Mozart. We talked about this. He sounds like him because of his own unique tools of composition, his turns of phrase and whatnot, but not necessarily that he sounds like the country that he was living in or even culture, that he specifically identified with. So our distinct American voice, this desire that composers had was partly motivated by political independence. That is, our country had won independence long ago, as you know, our history. And we wanted to show that we were a legitimate culture of our own, which is harder to do as a fairly young country, as to what makes us legitimate as our own country rather than a spin-off maybe of another country or something like that. Also, after World War I, there was a boom in an optimistic feeling, feeling like our country was very exceptional, and there was, just a lot of optimism after having, gotten through this war, this great war. Much of our talking about European, American sound, certainly at the beginning was centered on this idea of landscapes. We mentioned this in Copeland, and we'll mention it a lot more times, but the wide open spaces, as if all of America is one big wide open space. We know that's not true. We live near LA, right? And folk materials. This is a big preoccupation of composers to use folk materials. We're going to continue to talk about that lots and lots, whether folk melodies, rhythms, or whatnot. Our vernacular traditions, again, that's just a great word, vernacular, but all that it's saying is the things that are specific to our culture, not just our language, but individual dialects in different areas of the country, different traditions in different areas of the country. So those are things that are specific and uniquely suited towards us and not everyone. The risk in going solely nationalistic is we don't want it to be oversimplified. We don't want to suggest that every single American is the same or every American city is this? I mean, we know that this is not true. We also risk myth making, which kind of ties in with what I was just saying. This idea of everything's a wide open prairie and it's all open and beautiful. And it's like, well, that's not true. If you live in New York or LA or Chicago, or, any of these really big cities, it's huge and congested and there's a lot happening there. It's very different than if you lived in rural Iowa for your whole life or something. You're going to have a different image of what that America is like. So let's go on. Cosmopolitanism is really different. It's not completely opposite, but it's very different. So cosmopolitanism is embracing international styles. So this is true also in America. We not only had imports, that is, some great composers from Europe that came here, and we benefited from their expertise, but also our American composers that went there to Europe, to Leipzig, Paris, Vienna, all the big powerhouses of musical activity. Our composers were going there to be trained. So that is true. We as a country can't entirely stand on our own without influence from anybody else. Certainly not in this trying to develop a legitimacy of our own. We still need others. And we see that here, that we had some interdependence with Europe. On the other hand, we were still writing symphonies, concertos, operas, all of these European forms and structures were still being written here in America in the early part of the 20th century. And in fact, are still being written now. There are still living composers now that are writing symphonies and concertos and operas and all the other traditional forms. That's still true. They're being written in different ways. And we can talk about how that is over the course of the semester. But it's still true that all of those big forms and genres that began in Europe still are taking place here and many other places. So one argument that we'll see is that America proves maturity by participating in global culture rather than excluding it. And I think both things are true. So the idea of having just a nationalistic sound that is uniquely American does not exclude us from interacting with other countries, and the interaction that we have of composers from various countries coming together. We're going to see this really over the course of all semester, and certainly true of Gershwin and Copland and a lot of those major figures of the early part of the century. So one of the risks of cosmopolitanism, man, that's a great word, is cultural dependency. We don't want to see ourselves as completely dependent on Europe or any other area of the world as we're trying to show independence. But we do need to interact with those other countries, as I just said. So this idea of nationalism and cosmopolitanism, they're not complete opposites. We really need some of both to be able to create this specific American sound. So let's continue. Dvorak. We'll talk a lot about Dvorak a lot, especially in this early part of the semester, because he was a pivotal figure in this debate over American music. And as I mentioned to you in the last class session, he only lived here for about 3 years. He is not American. He was a Czech composer and lived most of his life there. But those 3 years that he lived here were crucial in this specific debate. And the reason why, we mentioned this already in the last class, but we'll mention it again. So he claimed that American music should be built on African American and indigenous melodies. So the idea that he came here and identified folk material that was already existing, and that he is telling other composers that this is what they should utilize to create something that sounds American, is remarkable in the fact that he has a high profile validation of these cultural groups that otherwise are historically marginalized. unfortunately, we know what history says about this, but these vernacular sources, as we see, these already existing folk materials from both African American groups and from Native Americans were not things that were prominent in the rest of culture, especially these institutions where he's speaking to composers were generally in academic settings like universities and whatnot. And this was unfortunately places that mostly these cultural groups were being excluded from. And so this really was remarkable for Dvorak to have this validation of these folk sources that were already existing. But it is a little bit complicated, and none of this is to bash Dvorak at all. But in terms of our current history, talking about a cultural appropriation and whatnot, does it make a lot of sense for a Czech composer to use folk materials from cultures that he didn't grow up in, he doesn't identify with, um, and maybe even is not very familiar with at all, but he's recognized that these are existing folk materials and saying you should just use those and plug them into your own pieces and then it'll sound American. That's all you have to do. But the idea of utilizing folk materials is usually that it's something that is common to you, something you grew up with. And so that's meaningful to you. You identify with that specific culture where those folk materials come from. So this is a really interesting debate. Again, I'm not bashing Dvorak in any way, but I'm glad that he really started this conversation because then he spurred on all of these composers to start attempting to sound American. And there are a lot of misses before there were hits. Okay. So lots and lots of American sounding pieces that weren't really American sounding still around the time that Dvorak came. But did really start a great debate as to what is going to really make music sound American. Okay, so let's continue. The New World Symphony is on your listening list. And if you haven't listened to it already, I have some additional things that you might listen for. And if you have already listened to it, that's okay. You can kind of just reflect back on what you already heard. Chances are you had already heard it anyway, and that's okay. So we're just going for some more intentional listening. So one thing you'll notice is that this is European symphonic form. Dvorak is still using all of the European techniques, traditions, forms, genres, all the things that he did when he was living in his homeland, bringing that here, still using the same techniques and all of that. So we're still seeing this typical type of symphonic form. You'll notice also that it's an evocation, I love that word, rather than a quotation of American material. And the difference really is that he's not quoting existing folk songs like "She'll Be Coming Round the Mountain," or something like that. He's making things that sound like folk material. So he wrote them himself. All of those tunes that you can probably whistle or hum or, take away with you once you're finished listening, all of those very folky sounding tunes are ones that he composed to sound folk-like. Okay, so he didn't specifically quote things that were already existing. You will notice pentatonic melodies, a lot of pentatonic melodies. And this is very common. We see this in lots of folk material, not just in American folk songs, but folk songs of many, many, many other cultures. This is just very common. You'll notice, as I said, very lyrical, hummable, singable, whistleable. Those are things that really get stuck in your head. You'll notice lots of great melodies, and you'll notice a really expansive orchestration, big, open, lots of instruments. It's a great symphony. And another thing, while you listen, or again, if you already have listened, you can reflect. Ask yourself, does it sound American? Or does it sound like European imagining America? So imagine if you go somewhere, say you go to Paris on vacation, and you go and you see all the sights and you experience Paris, and then you come back home and you write about it. Well, I'm going to be writing about it from the standpoint of me, an American, writing about my experience in Paris. But if you're someone who grew up in Paris, you might have a very different experience of what Paris is. And you might say that my experience was more like a tourist. I mean, I saw the sights and things, but I didn't necessarily see the real, authentic Paris and all the things that really make Paris what it is. Well, that's the same case here. So Dvorak came here and lived here for 3 years. He wasn't just a tourist, but he was not an American, didn't grow up in this culture or interact otherwise with these specific cultures where he's pulling the folk material from. And so that begs the question, is he really producing something that sounds American, or is he producing something that is his experience of what sounds American, which is not necessarily the same thing. And we're going to see this a lot. We have both Copland and Gershwin and many other composers traveled extensively and wrote pieces about their experiences other places. You probably know Gershwin's An American in Paris is one of like the most famous, but there are lots and lots of them where, he's not attempting to sound Parisian. He's just really portraying his own experience there, and that's an entirely separate thing. All right, let's continue. Early 20th century identity debates. There are several, probably actually a lot, and I just boiled them down into just a few bullet points here. So let's look at a few of them. So one of the factions of early 20th century composers were these radical experimentalists. Ives was one of these, although not all of his pieces sound so radically experimental, but a lot of them really do. They're just entirely outside the box thinking. And Henry Cowell was another one. If you aren't familiar with him, you'll have to look him up. And especially his piano pieces are so outside the box thinking. So you'll have to check that out. You also find a number of composers that are going the nationalist route. That's primarily what we've been talking about here, trying to plug in folk material to sound American. And then populism is a little bit later trend. We find it more so in the 1940s and onward. Copland was known as a populist composer, but that really was only one segment of his career. He had a long compositional career, and that was just one segment. He also was a modernist. He also experimented with 12 tone. He also did a lot of different things. But those populist pieces are, no surprise, his most popular pieces, like Appalachian Spring, for example, is probably his most popular thing that he wrote. Because those things are widely accessible. These are things that regular people can enjoy, even if they aren't otherwise up on all the most highbrow, most academic sounding music, still populism was to reach the masses, right? The most number of people. Okay, so these debates were not just aesthetic. It wasn't just about the overall sound that they were producing or how much we liked it. These reflected fears about elitism, right? Like the very highbrow academic music was very elitist. Like only the people that can really understand serialism or whatever deserve to appreciate it. And everybody else is, doesn't matter. Okay, that's one viewpoint. But you see also those that were more concerned about reaching everyone. We talked about populism, and modernity. Like what is the most modern? What is the most current? What is the most outside the box thinking that we can do? So all of these are concerns that composers have in this time period. All right, jazz. Jazz is still obviously hugely popular today, but in the early part of the 20th century, it was just beginning, budding out of ragtime rhythms and spirituals and other things. We have, like, a conflagration of many, many, many different types of musical styles that kind of birthed jazz. And it's really interesting to hear Copland and Gershwin and others in this early time of the 20th century try to define what jazz actually is. Especially considering today we have many, many, many subgenres of jazz, but this was just, early, early days. So this is one of the things that people tend to label as being uniquely American, jazz. But it was also condemned by some as being immoral or chaotic. It was looked down upon by some at the time. And we see this really in lots of new genres and new styles of music as they come up, like rock and roll, for example, in the 50s. Was considered countercultural. It was considered rebellious. It almost anytime we have a new something, there's a whole group of people that are going to be against it. And so that's what we saw with jazz. By some looking down upon it as being, immoral in the early part of the century. So we notice that these American debates are really not just about the music, but they're partly about what kind of country do we envision that we have or want to have. And we could probably have the same question today, that what kind of country I want to have versus what you have may be a different answer. Um, that's commonly true, but we see that come through into the American music debate because those that are expressing the wide open prairies and those that are expressing the hustling, bustling, New York City culture are entirely different. So anyway, we'll see that continue to pan out here in the next few weeks. All right, let's talk about technology. We already mentioned much of this in our last class session. So big technologies that had a huge effect in the early part of the 20th century, the phonograph, the radio, early mass media, yeah, lots of it. So phonograph, we talked about this, just being able to record and reproduce a specific performance over and over and over, and then sell it everywhere. Then anybody who owned a phonograph could play this anytime they wanted to. That was a brand new idea. So the idea that a composer's works could be out there all over the country, in fact, all over the world, was brand new. Same with radio. Radios were less expensive than pretty much anything at this time. And they were in almost every household within just a short time of it being invented. And that meant that the whole family could gather around and hear Gershwin. I gave you that example, but many other composers, symphonies that broadcast on certain days, like Saturday mornings, they gather around and listen just to that new music by those new composers they'd never heard of before. But now they can, and they wouldn't have otherwise. They wouldn't have been able to take their whole families to concert halls and pay, the ticket price and whatnot. It's expensive. So these are things that are making music now widely available that weren't available before. It's a big deal. Okay, so the effects we talked about, I just kind of rolled most of these in already. So the music becomes repeatable, right? Because you can play that record all the time and the performance is exactly the same, of course. This means it goes national, both the phonograph, the radio, even the player piano, which actually was invented in the late part of the 1800s and really still popular around the turn of the century, but it kind of waned out of favor by the 19 teens and early 20s because they're big, heavy, expensive. They take up a lot of room in your house. And you can buy those player piano scrolls. That's fantastic. You can replay them as many times as you want, just like a phonograph, but they're much more expensive. And then the radio came and took the place of that. So those player pianos, you don't find them nearly as much as you used to, and they're really expensive to maintain. Anyway, sorry, side note. All right, so music became national. As I said, you could disseminate it anywhere, both on the radio, the phonograph. Really big deal, and authoritative. So you see that the composer could play the music themselves, right? They or be present at the recording of whatever it was. And so then you know that that's exactly the way that they wanted it, which is very different than every individual performance of that may be different, even though they're reading from the same notes, as you know. Okay, so creation of shared listening experiences. That is, you could gather around the phonograph or the radio and listen to this together, was different. And shifting from the local music cultures where, you had to go to that place to hear it. Instead, you could just hear it in your home. This made a difference in our social experience also and how we experience that music. So one of the ideas that you'll notice in the reading, if you haven't already done it, or if you did, you can reflect on this, that technology didn't just spread American music, it made the idea of a national sound possible. If we hadn't had that, we would see a much slower pace of music spreading, and we would have, as we saw over the course of history, way back history, Middle Ages, Renaissance, etc. It took a long, long time to get information spread, even short distances, right? You had to write it down and take it there. Very different. And so when we think of our system of notation, that took place over hundreds of years, that this guy here created a staff, but it had 4 lines. And then this guy over here, he created a staff, it was like 6 lines. And then this guy had this other. So they're like, the history of notation is these different groups of people had all these different ideas, but none of them got together and all decided on one thing because they didn't know each other existed, because the spread of information was so much incredibly slow. And it wasn't until the printing press was developed that then things became printed and could be sent, as one standardized thing. So as by default, our staff became what it is. Now, this isn't a history of notation lecture, but the idea that that's what's happening here, that you can record something on a record and send it anywhere in the world. Now that makes something possible that wasn't possible before, right? So, and we talked about this even in class, that's a blessing and a curse, right? So it gets your information out there, may also cause everyone to feel they must normalize towards this thing rather than continuing to be separate and individual. So there's a blessing and a curse there. I recognize that. Okay, one other thing that was on your listening was Ives' Three Places in New England. And again, if you haven't listened yet, I have a few things here that you can listen for. And if you have already listened, then you can reflect on that. So Ives, again, really interesting figure. He's worth studying some more. But his approach here was not necessarily to solve that American identity problem, the one that we've been discussing, but more exposing it, really thinking outside the box and really coming at it with his absolutely unique take on composing. It's just very different. So his idea is more pluralism. We're not to populism yet. My bad. So pluralism is more this idea of many, many different styles and things that he's overlaying in his composition. So we see hymns, we see marches, other popular tunes. And I told you, that idea of colliding sounds, if you were sitting watching a parade and one marching band had just passed and another one was coming up, and you're hearing those two sounds kind of colliding with one another. That's what he's reflecting here, is all these sort of overlapping sounds. And it's not that he's trying to reconcile those sounds all into one harmonious whole. They really just collide. And it's really outside the box thinking. So in this way, he's expressing an America that is more layered and noisy and unresolved, not the expansive prairies and other things that we were talking about. It's just a really different sound. So when you're listening, you can ask yourself or reflect if you already have listened, what do you hear? How do you hear things simultaneously? So are you hearing overlapping of different things? And how do you feel like he addresses nationalism or cosmopolitanism? Do you hear either one of those here? And why might this have been unintelligible or threatening to early audiences? You imagine the first time hearing something like this, you might be scratching your head, or you might be yelling and screaming at what awful thing this is, or maybe you love it. I mean, I can see how it would have had some big opinions of early audiences. And how does this contrast with what you heard from Dvorak and the New World Symphony? It's entirely different. Dvorak was going a little bit more for a synthesis that is taking the folk materials and kind of interweaving them into his symphony, whereas Ives has coexistence of many different styles that he's kind of overlaid. He's not trying to really blend them all together. It's just an entirely different approach, isn't it? Okay, so last thing about Ives, and then we'll conclude. Why does Ives matter? And why does Ives matter? Sorry, and why was he ignored? Okay, well, there are a lot of reasons for this, and I mentioned to you one aspect that his music wasn't performed for much of his lifetime and wasn't published for much of his lifetime. So it wasn't until late in his career that others began to be aware of him. So that's one big issue. But ask you the question, was he too American? Uh, was he too American? That's a good question. Was he too experimental? Well, probably this early, right? That's the next question. Was he too early? Somebody has to break the box, right? Somebody has to break the mold. And he was a mold breaker, I guess, in this sense. He really was thinking outside the box. And although that doesn't necessarily make it lovely and enjoyable to listen to always, it does make you ask questions. And I think that's a big point of what it is. So his later rediscovery, that means people discovering him after he was alive, actually, in many cases, they weren't aware of him prior to that. This gives a usable past for American modernism. So as Copeland was examining modernism and how did that look for him, then he was able to study what Ives had done, even though that was well prior to his career. It wasn't, no one was aware of it prior to his career. So that's an interesting history to look at, a history that becomes current, right? And there's a little overlap there. And we're also going to notice not just Copland, I've mentioned a lot of times, and Gershwin and Bernstein, they're going to try to make this American tradition more legible, more understandable to individuals than what Ives was doing. But because Ives broke the mold, then others were able to follow. So that is one of the big significant points of Ives' career, and that's why we continue to go back and reference him in his uniqueness, right? Okay, just a couple of closing thoughts. I'd like you to compare Dvorak and Ives and think, how was it different? Not only how they expressed America, how do you think they imagine what America is? I mean, they lived in two different places and they had two different, well, many different experiences in their lives. But I think they were portraying an entirely different America, and it may be a different one than what you have experienced as well. So I'd like you to compare how you envision Dvorak imagined America to be versus how Ives did. And what problems did each of them solve or not solve? And certainly in some ways, they just shine the light on there being a problem and attempted to provide a solution. So these are things that we're going to continue to discuss in this class. Next week in person, we'll discuss Aaron Copland and the construction of a national sound. And I told you I had lots to say about Copland, but he specifically had a lot to say about what makes American music. It's not just his specific style. It's that he himself wrote a lot and lectured a lot about what specifically America is, and that was a preoccupation of his to be a part of creating that specific sound. So that's part of why we're talking about him here. All right, I will see you in class.